So I'm just going to talk about gender identity and how that notion evolved from its beginnings in the 1960s to the notion that we have today. So since we're in Greece, the home of the most famous transitioner and detransitioner, actually it turns out looking at Zhenya's slides that we have the same idea. It was like obvious. So this is the blind prophet Tiresias. He hit a pair of mating snakes and as punishment was transformed into a woman by the goddess Hera. I should emphasize this was punishment. Anyway, he detransitioned 7 years later. Tiresias appears in two plays, Antigone and Oedipus Rex, by the renowned Athenian playwright Sophocles, and I thought that some of Tiresias's wise words from Antigone would be appropriate for this conference. All men may err, but error once committed, he's no fool nor unsuccessful who can change his mind and cure the trouble he has fallen in. Stubbornness and stupidity are twins. Okay, so gender identity, this is a Google Ngram of gender identity showing its frequency in books and publications, and as you can see, kind of took off around what Time magazine called the transgender tipping point in 2014, and it began in the 60s, and of course 1994 was when the DSM-IV came out and gender identity disorder replaced the older diagnosis of transsexualism. So where did gender identity begin? Well, it's first clearly defined in 1964 by two psychiatrists at UCLA, one of whom Ken just mentioned, Robert Stoller. The other was Ralph Greenson. This is Greenson on the right. As I never tire of mentioning, he was Marilyn Monroe's psychiatrist. So both Stoller's definition of gender identity and Greenson's are similar, but let's look at Greenson's. Let me enlarge that so you can see it. Gender identity refers to one's sense of being a member of a particular sex. In other words, gender identity is just the conviction that you're male, or alternatively, the conviction that you're female. And here's the well-known psychologist Lawrence Kohlberg in a paper in 1966, duplicating Stoller and Greenson's definition, although without acknowledgement. Maybe scholarly norms were different back in the day. Gender identity, he says, is the cognitive self-categorization as boy or girl. And of course, he's just talking about children. That's why he uses boy or girl as opposed to male or female, but it all basically boils down to the same thing. Now, Stoller, I should say, took back with one hand what he gave with the other almost immediately. So a few years after the 1964 paper, he went back on his earlier terminology and used gender identity for something else, reserving core gender identity for what he had previously called gender identity. So here's Stoller. Actually, this is the last thing that Stoller wrote, a paper published in 1992. He died in 1991, tragically, in a car accident outside his home in Los Angeles. So he starts this paper saying, let me begin with a vocabulary review. Gender identity refers to a complex system of beliefs about oneself, a sense of one's masculinity and femininity. Okay, so that's obviously not the earlier definition. The earlier definition is down here. By core gender identity, I mean the sense we have of the sex to which we belong, that we feel we are male or female. Okay, so in my view, Stoller should have just kept to the original terminology. Gender identity, as he defines it here, well, it's not really properly defined. It's really very obscure. I don't know what my sense of my masculinity and femininity is exactly. Presumably, it's somewhat different from Ken's sense of his masculinity and femininity, in which case we have different gender identities in Stoller's new sense, which doesn't sound like the right result. Okay, so just sticking with what Stoller later called core gender identity, that is the Stoller-Greenson kind of gender identity. This was a great label for, an obvious phenomenon. There comes a point fairly early in life when children realize that they're either male or female. They see that their peers are divided into these two great classes, and at some point they realize, yes, well, I'm one of these or one of those. I'm either a boy or a girl, or female or male. And just introducing that label for that notion spurred a lot of great developmental psychology. So psychologists have studied gender stability when children realize that just growing up doesn't turn you from a male into a female, or vice versa. They've also studied gender consistency. When do children realize that a change of clothing or a change of behavior doesn't change sex? So that's all great. Excellent. So in the Stoller-Greenson sense, gender identity is both well-defined, it's very clear, and it's a useful term. And there's no suggestion that the sense of being a member of one's sex, that is the explanation of how it is that I came to realize when I was very young that I'm a member of the male sex, or that I'm a boy, there's no suggestion that that is like a very mysterious process. Sexing other people is very easy. Sexing oneself presumably uses the same sorts of capacities. Okay, great. Now, note that a mismatch between one's gender identity in the Stoller-Greenson sense and one's natal sex is not required either to have gender dysphoria or to be a trans man or a trans woman. It's certainly not required to have gender dysphoria. I might, as a male, have gender dysphoria and know full well that I am a male. In fact, that piece of knowledge might make my dysphoria worse. And of course, it's not necessary to be a trans man or a trans woman, that there's any kind of mismatch. I mean, my go-to example is the trans man Buck Angel, who's certainly not shy about telling everyone that he's female. So he has a female gender identity in the Stoller-Greenson sense that matches his natal sex. He's a trans man nonetheless. And just on point B, here's an old quote from a paper by Ken and Richard Green. It may well be that the clinical picture has changed slightly since 1992. But anyway, they say, in general, however, older youngsters with gender identity problems do not misclassify their sex, but will voice the desire to be of the opposite sex or to find a little that is positive about their own sex. Okay, so things started to go downhill by the time of the DSM-III, actually, back in 1980. So that had the diagnosis of transsexualism and gender identity disorder of childhood. And Robert Stoller and John Money were both on the DSM-III Advisory Committee for Psychosexual Disorders. And so if you read the section that's called Gender Identity Disorders, it starts off, I'm going to get back to this in a sec, the essential feature, gender identity disorders is an incongruence between anatomic sex and gender identity. And then the next sentence is in fact the first sentence of Stoller's 1964 paper, where he explains gender identity. Gender identity is the sense of knowing to which sex one belongs, that is the awareness that I am a male or I am a female. And then, obviously, this illustrates why one should never write anything by committee. This passage then continues with Money's confusing and idiosyncratic definition of gender identity, as if it's like the same thing as Stoller's definition of gender identity. It is totally different. Money was very, as you know, if you've read any Money, he was a prolific neologizer, like coining new terms and so on. And he was very proud of this definition of gender identity, which had it out to be the flip side of gender role. So gender identity, according to Money, is the private experience of gender role, and gender role is the public expression of gender identity. Gender role can be defined as everything that one says and does, including sexual arousal, to indicate to others or to the self the degree to which one is male or female. And gender identity is the private experience of that, whatever that means. But in any event, I mean, he loved this definition. He repeated it numerous times. But in any event, it is completely different from the Stoller definition. And of course, again, as with Stoller's redefinition of gender identity later as the sense of one's masculinity and femininity, it looks like on Money's definition of gender identity, Ken and I are going to have different gender identities. Okay, so that was bad enough, but then just going back to the first bit of the DSM passage about gender identity disorders, the incongruence, the essential feature of gender identity disorders is an incongruence between anatomic sex and gender identity. That is, like, the essential feature of gender identity disorders is that your anatomic sex is male, but you have a conviction, at least if we take gender identity in the Stoller sense, you have a conviction that you're female, or the other way around. But then, of course, if you look at the diagnostic criteria for transsexualism, it doesn't mention such an incongruence at all, as of course it shouldn't. It's obviously you can have what was then called transsexualism and desire to transition and know perfectly well what your natal sex is. Okay, so another landmark paper in the slow decline of clarity on these topics was due to Walter Bochting, who's at the Columbia University School of Medicine, and he wrote a paper in 1999 where he gave what was then coming to be the sort of orthodox conception of what it is to be transgender, where it's this like massively capacious notion. Transgender people are a diverse group of individuals who cross or transcend culturally defined categories of gender. Male to female and female to male transsexuals, okay, that's great. Cross-dressers or transvestites. Transgenderists, like the transsexuals, except they don't go in for surgery. Bigender persons, those who identify as both man and woman, maybe that's like a precursor of today's non-binary. Drag queens and kings, and like astoundingly female and male impersonators. Males who impersonate women and females who impersonate men, usually for entertainment. So the great Australian, dearly departed Barry Humphries would be transgender on this conception. Okay, well anyway, that's the it may be useful for political purposes to think of transgender people in this way, but obviously for like theoretical work or clinical work, surely it's totally useless. These people are so absurdly diverse. Okay, so that's transgender, but then Bochting defines gender identity in a way that's very, very close to the Stoller-Greenson conception, but he adds this like tiny wrinkle at the end. He says, gender identity refers to one's basic conviction of being a man or a woman, or another gender, such as transgender. Like even, okay, another gender, what is that exactly? What on earth does he mean by that? And then it's even more puzzling because like the leading example of another gender is transgender, and he's just explained that it's this massively capacious category. It doesn't really make any sense. Anyway, this was taken up. So Bochting, who was on the list of authors for Standards of Care 7 in 2012, that paper was cited in the glossary where we get this explanation what it is to be what it is to be transgender, somewhat similar, although more concise than Bochting's own definition. Adjective to describe a diverse group of individuals who cross or transcend culturally defined categories of gender. And again, it's like very obscure what categories of gender are. Okay, so then Bochting also influenced the Standards of Care 7 entry for gender identity, and notice how there is now a sort of subtle shift from having a basic conviction of being male or female to something that hints that the access to this fact, if indeed it is a fact that you're male or female, is somewhat mysterious. So instead of just sense of being, it becomes an intrinsic sense of being. And again, we have this addition to Stoller and Greenson, namely, it's not just your sense of being male or female, but also an alternative gender. And here we do get a list, which includes, again, very head-scratchingly transgender, also includes eunuch. Okay, so in the Standards of Care 7, you also get this causal explanation of gender dysphoria in terms of gender identity. Gender dysphoria is distress that is caused by a discrepancy between a person's gender identity and that person's sex assigned at birth. So we saw earlier that the original Stoller-Greenson sense of gender identity, that's not, or certainly needn't be, the causal explanation of gender dysphoria. You can have gender dysphoria even though your natal sex and your Stoller-Greenson gender identity are perfectly aligned. So it can't be that the misalignment is causing the dysphoria, because there is no misalignment. However, in Standards of Care 7, we do get the idea that that is the cause. It's like a little mini theory of gender dysphoria. It's the mismatch between, or a discrepancy, or an incongruence between a person's gender identity and the person's anatomic sex, or as we say these days, person's sex assigned at birth. And by the time we get to Standards of Care 8 in 2022, the plain old conviction of being male and female has now been replaced by something that suggests a very special way of accessing one's own gender. So it's not just an intrinsic sense, it's a deeply felt, internal, intrinsic sense And now, like, sex has just totally dropped out of the picture, and it's a sense of one's own gender, whatever that may be. There is actually an entry for gender in Standards of Care 8, but it's just totally confusing. It's obviously not what gender means here in the definition of gender identity. Now we get this shift from the capacious sense of transgender to, in a way, a somewhat narrower conception, which is defined in terms of gender identity. So you can see it clearly in Standards of Care 8 when they explain what cisgender means. So cisgender refers to people whose current gender identity corresponds to the sex they were assigned at birth. And then, obviously, they don't actually explicitly say this, but obviously transgender in this new usage refers to people whose current gender identity doesn't correspond to the sex they were assigned at birth. Sorry, corresponds to is underlined. And this is clearly expressed in a paper by, a 2019 paper by Jack Turban and colleagues. Transgender persons are those whose sex assigned at birth differs from their gender identity, the inner sense of their own gender. So now we have the conception of two very different kinds of people. Right? Humanity is divided into two very different kinds of people. The cisgendered people whose gender identity matches or is congruent with their anatomic sex or sex assigned at birth, and these other people, the transgender people, in whom gender identity and sex are incongruent. So this is a bit like very different from this super capacious sense of gender identity on which it refers to anyone who's like vaguely gender non-conforming. And again, in Standards of Care 8, we have the little mini causal theory of gender dysphoria. It's caused by a difference, an incongruence between the person's gender identity and their sex assigned at birth. All right. The state of distress or discomfort is brought about because of this difference. Okay, and then another idea came along as well, which is that, so far we've been talking about, the sense of one's own gender, or the intrinsic sense of one's own gender. Never mind what gender is. Of course, it could be that I have an intrinsic sense that my gender is G, but actually it isn't G. So it's like perfectly compatible with what has been said so far, that when people have an intrinsic sense of their own gender, they're mostly wrong. But of course, that isn't the view. Instead, the view is that, as Rafferty puts it in that position statement from the AAP, research substantiates that children who are prepubertal and assert a TGD identity know their gender as clearly, as consistently as their developmentally equivalent peers who identify as cisgender. In other words, when you have some inner sense that you are of gender G, whatever this means, you're pretty much going to be right. Maybe you're always going to be right, but at any rate, 99% of the time you're going to be right. So just comparing then the old useful Stoller-Greenson sense of gender identity with the modern sense of gender identity. So let's look at the target first of all. That is, you have a sense of being, or an intrinsic sense of being, what? Well, in the case of Stoller and Greenson, it's sex, and in the modern sense of gender identity, it's gender, whatever that is. Okay, so what about the access? By what means or mechanism do we have access to our own sex in the Stoller-Greenson case, or gender in the contemporary sense of gender identity? Well, in the Stoller-Greenson sense, the access is nothing special. There's no reason to think that humans are born with some special dedicated faculty for discerning their own sex. It's easy enough to sex other people. You can just apply the capacities you have to sex other people to yourself. However, in the modern sense of gender identity, we do have this special access, or so it's strongly suggested. We have some kind of inner sense of our own, well, not sex, but gender. Okay, is this conviction we have that we're one sex or the other, or alternatively, in a sense we have that we're one gender or another, is that more or less infallible? Could it ever go wrong? Well, interestingly, I mean, this is partly why this, I think, massive difference between the old Stoller-Greenson sense and the new-fangled sense of gender identity is somewhat hard to see. It's somewhat hard to see because there are actually so many commonalities between the two that are sort of somewhat, they're somewhat superficial, but sort of when you look more deeply, you realize that the differences are actually very deep. So just take infallibility. Well, yeah, for like totally unmysterious reasons, the conviction people have of their own sex is pretty much close to infallible, just because it's like so blindingly obvious. It's very, very rare for people to be mistaken about what sex they are. So it's very close to infallible. And this is a commonality between the old sense and the new sense. In the new sense, it's infallible as well, or close to infallible. But not because the target is sex and the mechanism is totally familiar. The target is gender, and the mechanism is this mysterious inner sense. Okay, does gender identity define the cis-trans distinction? Well, in the Stoller-Greenson sense, no, it does not. There's no defining what it is to be transgender or a trans woman in terms of the Stoller-Greenson sense of gender identity. But it does define cis-trans in the modern sense. Is it fixed? That is your gender identity unchangeable or pretty much unchangeable? Well, this is another commonality between the two, which makes it a bit hard to see that the two different conceptions of gender identity are really very different. Yeah, it's almost fixed in the Stoller-Greenson sense. People very rarely change their minds about whether they're male or female. And that's true in the modern sense as well. And does the mismatch cause gender dysphoria? No, in the Stoller-Greenson sense, and yes, in the modern sense. Okay, so the modern sense is suited to the sort of modern conception of being a transgender child. So here's a Google Ngram for transgender child, and trans child, trans kid. Things really started to take off. Well, there was nothing like before 2000, and then there was a sharp rise again, I think, around the transgender tipping point. 2000 was when Jazz Jennings, the famous child reality star who was, I think, diagnosed with gender dysphoria at age 4 or 5, or extremely early, and whose transition was documented in excruciating detail on television. That was when she was born. So if we contrast the old school with the new school, so on the old way of thinking, some gender dysphoric children will desist. Their gender dysphoria will just go away around puberty or maybe later. Some will persist, and some may be helped by transitioning later. The persisters, they're not qualitatively different from the desisters. They're just like, there is a difference between people who have anxiety and it goes away eventually, and people whose anxiety never goes away. But they're not like qualitatively different people. There's no special, region of the brain that's completely different between the two. So transgender child, on the old school way of thinking, is just very confusing terminology and shouldn't be used. And this is a quote, a kind of old school quote from Domenico Di Ceglie, who was a child and adolescent psychiatrist who founded England's Gender Identity Development Service in 1989, which is now closed, of course, following various scandals. In order for adolescents to make properly informed decisions, it is recommended that they have experience of themselves in the post-pubertal state of their biological sex. Okay, so that's old school. What about the new school? Well, according to the new school, gender dysphoria is caused by a gender identity body mismatch. And having a gender identity body mismatch is being transgender. That's what it is, to be transgender. So if you think about it for a bit, dysphoria indicates that the child is transgender. Actually, it's not possible to have, if you take these definitions seriously, it is actually not possible to have gender dysphoria without being transgender. Okay, so the child has gender dysphoria. So that's due to a mismatch between the child's gender identity and their anatomic sex. And we know that the dysphoria is caused by this discrepancy. And obviously, we want to relieve the distress. We want to make the dysphoria go away or abate. Well, we can't change. This is part of the theory of gender identity, the new theory of gender identity. We certainly can't change the gender identity. That's pretty much fixed, stable feature of the person. So the only solution is to change the body. So hence we get medicalization if desired. And on this way of thinking of things, transgender child is just indispensable terminology. I mean, there are just as there are two kinds of adults, there are two kinds of children. Children in whom their gender identity is aligned with their sexed body, and children in whom it's not aligned, incongruent with. And so on this way of thinking, if you deny the existence of transgender children, well, this is from the McNamara white paper criticizing the Cass Review. So McNamara is at Yale. Jack Turban's also an author, I think, on this white paper. So you can see, from their point of view, as they say, they're talking about the Cass Review and how some people Cass consulted said, oh, there aren't any such things as trans kids. There are no transgender children. And they got very annoyed at that, but you can kind of see where they're coming from. Denying the existence of transgender people of any age, specifically trans children, is an invalid professional viewpoint. And because I think they're thinking of gender identity in the newfangled sense, it also it gives them an obvious explanation of why, as they say, why most youth who receive early supportive interventions continue on to gender-affirming hormone therapy. Well, why is that? Well, on their view, it's that the youth are indeed transgender. That's the obvious explanation there. Their gender identity really does differ from, really does misalign or really is incongruent with their anatomic sex. That's why they carry on. All right, so just a couple of other things. I mean, obviously, a lot of people here know so much more about the history than I do. It's kind of interesting if you look at the two famous Dutch studies, De Vries 2011 and 2014. So in De Vries 2011, the population are described as young transsexuals. And then in De Vries, the follow-up paper, 3 years later, 2014, they are transgender adolescents. And I came across this old quote from 1971 from Richard Green, deprecating the use. So this is like back in 1971, deprecating the use of, well, as he said, not young transsexuals, but juvenile transsexuals. There is an additional point to be made before describing some children with anomalous gender behavior. I do not believe it is at all proper to call these children juvenile transsexuals until we have, and that the next sentence seems very sensible, until we have long-term adult follow-up data on a large series, including untreated cases. We do not know that these are the boys who are going to be transsexuals. Okay, so just to sum up, just show my slide again, illustrating the difference between the old kosher conception of gender identity and, as I see it, the newfangled, obscure, bad notion of gender identity. And then finally, maybe we should go back to Tiresias. Stubbornness and stupidity are twins. Thank you.